This is History 425, 525. It's week 6. And this week, we're going to talk about the Cultural Revolution. Let's go to slide 2. Last week, we talked about the 100 Flowers movement that invited criticism from the public, especially from intellectuals. And we talked about the crackdown that occurred after that, the anti-rightist movement, because Mao and others were very surprised at all the criticism that did result. Then we talked about the Great Leap Forward, Mao's plan to bring China into the modern age, surpass Britain in steel production and so forth in a big hurry, and the famine that resulted from that. I'm looking again at slide 2 now. And we discussed Mao's phony retreat, really, away from policy, where he really set up a counterattack against the people he thought were his enemies inside the party by first going to the countryside and attacking cadres there who he set parameters to measure who was socialist, who was revolutionary, and who was not. People who had carried through the reforms were criticized wherever possible. And then the socialist education movement started to turn toward the cities, and that's where we're going to pick up now. I want to have a brief review of the famine, though. The estimates you'll see for the number of people who died in the Great Famine that occurred between 1958 and 59 and into 61 range between 15 million and 40 million or more. The 15 million comes from approved websites and scholarly research inside of China. That is stuff that's not censored, that the party approves of. And the higher figures come from outside of China by different academics who have done research on the documents that are available and using witness interviews and other methods. And the famine is called by 2 different names in China, and this is not an unusual thing, and it's an important thing to know about because it is something that occurs quite often. There's a lot in a name when it comes to controversial and tragic events in Chinese history. The name that's used in China that's approved, that you must use if you're going to get a book published, is the 3 years of natural disasters, the 3年自然灾害, 3年自然灾害. And that's the name that you see on that book cover that's in the middle of this slide. Down below that book cover, there's a grainy, very faded picture that is from an official Chinese website showing victims of the famine. And as you can see, these victims of the famine are very hungry. They're pressing toward where they can get a bowl of food. But it's not nearly as gruesome as some of the other images that you can find that were from photography taken inside China, but the stuff is posted on websites outside of China that are outside the control of the Communist Party. So I think it was last week we talked about the famine and mentioned that people actually ate the bark off of trees, and here you have an iconic photograph of a man actually trying to eat the bark off of a tree stump or a branch or whatever that is that he has in his hand. You won't see a photograph like this on a mainland Chinese-controlled website. Nor will you see the name that is not preferred inside China by the Ministry of by the party's propaganda department. You will not see the name 3-year famine or 3年大饥荒. That's just not allowed because it implies that there was more than just a natural disaster. And here is the key point, and that is that the party today still, in spite of having repudiated most of Mao's policies, they do not want to blame the famine on the policies of Mao Zedong. Instead, they want to allege that there were some mistakes made, certainly, but really the problem was natural disasters. But studies that have been done for many years now have consistently shown that that's not the case. There were no natural disasters that were sufficient to actually have a significant impact on the number of people who died during this period. One of the man-made sort of natural disasters was the killing of millions and millions of sparrows in the countryside. There's on the left you see a poster regarding that, and you can imagine if everybody in the Chinese countryside is trying to kill sparrows, how many end up being killed. And this had a tremendous impact because when all these birds were gone, then all the insects that they ate no longer had natural enemies, and you can imagine how that turned out. It meant that there were insects eating grain instead of birds eating grain. A heck of a lot of grain being eaten, seed in the ground being eaten, grain that's already growing before harvest being eaten instead of it being nibbled on by birds. So there you go. I shouldn't linger anymore on this topic. Let's go on to the next slide. I'm not going to go through this, slide 3. I just want to point out that it's here for your reference. I updated it a little bit. I was listening to a YouTube lecture by a famous Chinese historian who's now deceased named Gao Hua. Gao Hua was pointing out something that I haven't heard anybody else point out before, probably because I wasn't listening, and that is that between August 1961 and May 1962, for that 10-month period, this was the only time during Mao Zedong's rule of the mainland from 1949 into 50, and when he died in 1976, this was the only time when there was not a political campaign going on. For the rest of his tenure as the great leader, there was some sort of political campaign in progress. And what was happening then? This was well, I guess you could say it was the height of the famine, and it was the period when the famine began to lose steam because investment into things like steel was slowed down, and instead the investment was redirected toward agriculture. Private plots were allowed so that people would have some incentive to actually grow things, that sort of thing that we discussed last week. Going on to slide 4. You've seen this before. I'm putting it in there again for you for your reference. The review of major political campaigns between the founding of the People's Republic, or right after that, in 1949-50, and the end of Mao Zedong in 1976. So let's continue on now into the main part of the lecture. Skip over 5. We'll talk about the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the full name for it is the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, the 伟大文化大革命, or just the 文化大革命. I'm sorry, I'm getting it wrong. The 无产阶级文化大革命. I guess there are 3 of you studying Chinese. I'm ashamed of myself. The Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Proletariat in Chinese means without property, so the persons without property Cultural Revolution. So I want to go through some some basic facts about it, and if you forget everything else in this lecture, please try to absorb what's in this slide. There was no actual decade of a cultural revolution. In China nowadays, official historians say that it was the 10 years of chaos. But it did not last for 10 years at all. Really, it lasted for about 3, and some people stretch it out to 5, 1966 to 71. The second thing is that there's only one dude who was responsible for all of this, and it was Mao Zedong. The whole Gang of 4 thing is a canard, it's a charade, it's a bunch of BS. While it's true that the 4 individuals whom we will identify as we go, who were called the Gang of 4 after Mao's death, were close associates of Mao, there were plenty of others who ranked as high as some of those 4, and who were just as responsible, just as important to the processes involved as these 4 individuals, including Mao's wife. Probably nobody was more important than Mao's wife. She stands out for certain. And as we will learn next week, when she was arrested and put on trial, she famously said on national television, for some reason the regime decided to cover her, and there's probably a good reason for that. At her trial, she declared that I was Chairman Mao's dog. Whoever he told me to bite, I bit. And that was certainly true. But to continue with this slide, in 1966, we'll go through all this in a little bit more detail. He began to launch attacks on his enemies in the early part of the year after having prepared the ground very carefully. His enemies that he perceived, anyway, included Liu Shaoqi, who is pictured here, and Deng Xiaoping, who became China's paramount leader after Mao died. The local struggles that flared up all over the country between Red Guard groups, encouraged by Mao, got out of control, to state it simply, and people began fighting each other, first with sticks and rocks, later with firearms, and eventually some of them got into the arsenals of the local army units and brought out heavier weapons. So they were engaging in open warfare in some cities by late 1967 and into 1968. And Mao had to bring the army back to restore order, and then he turned around, and a year later he started to purge army people so that he could put the party back in charge. It was all a very bizarre exercise. So people often say, and it's a question that's posed to you in the Meisner book, why did Mao do this? Part of the answer that is developing now, and people have debated this for many years, foreign scholars have debated this for many years, as have Chinese scholars, is that his paranoia became so acute that his mental instability became so pronounced that he believed that people around him who were scared to death of him and who worshipped him, they didn't always agree with everything he wanted to do, but they always followed his orders. Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, and the rest. He believed that they were his enemies. And this is one reason why he put off open denunciation of them. He could have started this as early as 1962 or 63. But instead, what he did was he engaged in a very careful game where he withdrew ostensibly from government, allowing them, as we put it in our own culture, allowing them enough rope to hang themselves. In other words, letting them build up a record of things that really pissed him off, such as allowing individual families to farm their own fields, which he thought were sprouts of capitalism, and then making a case against them when he felt the time was right. Let's go on to slide 7. The army was very, very important in this whole process. I'm starting off now giving you an overview of issues, and then we'll get into the timeline, the specifics of the Cultural Revolution. The army was very, very important, and I don't mean to be cynical, but the basic reason the army was so important to Mao Zedong in the Cultural Revolution was that the army was wholly beholden to him after he got rid of the top generals he wanted to get rid of. He knew that the lower ranks had been successfully converted by Defense Minister Lin Biao into devoting a large amount of their time to political study, much larger than before. That they were absorbing Mao Zedong thought, and that this meant that their level of obedience to Chairman Mao's instructions would be greater than other sectors of society. And this is why this whole Lei Feng, there's Mr. Lei Feng in the photo there, this Lei Feng emulation campaign began. Study Lei Feng, 学习 Lei Feng. Lei Feng was a bizarre character. He was a real person, but God only knows what happened to him. For some odd reason that has never been explained, he was the subject of an awful lot of photographs, probably thousands of them, in the year before he supposedly died, having been crushed by a telephone pole. And I'm not making any of this up. It's the most ridiculous thing you could possibly think of. It's almost like The Onion or National Lampoon or Saturday Night Live does a sketch on China and tries to make it ridiculous. But this is the actual claim. So there are all these thousands of photographs, and by golly, it was just so convenient to make Lei Feng into a model, a hero. And if you look at the film clip that we have on D2L this week of the film Morning Sun, it includes a little bit of footage from a film made about Lei Feng. So there you go. It's weird, but it was what it was. Going on to slide 8. So to dive a little bit now into this whole thing about the party leadership and Chairman Mao. At the center in Beijing, in the Politburo, in the and you remember that this is the smallest group of high party officials who make all the big decisions, the Politburo, or which is short for Political Bureau. In Chinese, it's the 政治局. Bureau is 局, and 政治is politics. The Political Bureau, which comes from the Russian word in its English translation, was the smallest group of people who were the standing committee of the Politburo at this point, is what they were called, and they considered all the issues that couldn't be solved at levels below. And when Mao would disagree with them, they would all have to stop and fall in line. He had the ultimate vote, and this was true from the start, really, in the Korean War. When China entered the Korean War, you may recall, most of the Politburo was against it. Mao was for it, and Mao said, sorry, but I've decided we're going to go in, and they all obeyed. So, although many scholars like to say that he was first among equals at this early period in the 50s, and he only began to be almost the dictator of the Politburo from 1957. Really, he was more than first among equals even at the beginning of the People's Republic. And it came to the point where other senior officials tried to anticipate what he was thinking. And it became even worse, of course, after the Cultural Revolution began, when those who survived were absolutely frightened to death for themselves. I've already explained that third bullet a moment ago, that Mao was paranoid, angry, and vengeful, and that he knew that that the best thing to draw his enemies out would be to lull them into complacency. Things were different far away from Beijing. There's this saying in Chinese, the emperor is high and far away, which means that if you are not near the capital, then things are a lot easier on you, and that's certainly true in any country, I'd say. Provincial and military region commanders who were hundreds and thousands of miles from Beijing, they often did ignore Mao's orders, but never openly. They would get orders from Beijing, and they would have to follow them to some degree, but they did. It was a different story out there than it was in the center, where people really had to obey everything that Mao said. But again, there was no possibility of doing so openly because of Mao's enormous prestige as the successful leader of the Chinese Revolution. And if you were to openly oppose Mao, even if you were 2,000 miles away in some remote part of the country, then of course not only would your career be over with, but you would be dead meat. We'll stop here and go on to slide 9.